Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tueller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on March 19th with Maureen Brady on Scottish Family History Research, Historical and Geographical Background. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner on discovering your Spanish-speaking ancestral heritage around the world. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James Tanner has spent over 18 years as a family history volunteer and is presently serving at the BYU Library Family History Center. He is on the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. And we'll now turn the time over to James.
Okay, well, welcome to the BYU Library Family History Center webinar series. Our webinars are recorded, as mentioned, and they're posted on our website for the BYU Family History Center and also on our YouTube channel. So these are places where you can go back and view these videos. Today we're going to be talking about discussing your Spanish-speaking ancestral heritage around the world and some important things. First of all, there are 21 countries in the world in which their official language is Spanish. And you can see the list here. I'm not going to read through all the names, but this is probably a significant portion of North and South America and all of Central America. So it's Spanish is a very significant language worldwide. As a matter of fact, it's the second most spoken language in the world. And it's the only one that is more, and it's considerably more, is Mandarin Chinese. And a lot of people think English is one of the most popular languages, but it's a little bit behind Spanish in its acceptance. So you can kind of see a list here of the languages and their percentage and native speakers in the millions. So there's a fairly large, significant Spanish-speaking population out there. And another thing about the Spanish-speaking people is that they're probably Spanish speakers in almost every country of the world. It's one of those languages where people leave the countries their where they were born and where they go to live someplace else. So this is, it's not unusual. As a matter of fact, I just spoke just a few minutes ago in a consultation with a Spanish-speaking person who was living in Canada. And I often get calls for appointments for consultations from Spanish speakers in very unusual places like Japan or otherwise you would not think of people speaking Spanish. So it's a worldwide kind of phenomena. In order to understand uh, where where Spanish is probably predominantly spoken, and where there are records for Spanish ancestry, is the first thing is to know a little bit of the history. And in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, the Spanish Empire covered 13 million square kilometers or 5 million square miles, making it one of the largest empires in the history. There's hasn't been very many of the empires, like even the Roman Empire or some of the Asian empires that can match what Spain had at that period of time. The problem you have when you look at a map like this is kind of the projection here on the map makes some things look large and other things look smaller than they actually are. And if you were comparing actual full sizes to each other, the proportions between the different countries be the same. In the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1492, it divided the New World into Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence. It actually created a, a line, north-south line for between the two areas. However, the line changed over time, and the um, border of Brazil is a lot less and isn't straight. It follows river paths mostly across in its area. This was originally, and of course, there was a lot of times you'll hear in the history, if you go back to this history, that was the Pope who did the split, but in actuality, the Pope did have an input, but it was an actual treaty between Spain and Portugal. Now, with the church, with the Roman Catholic Church came with the empire and with the Portuguese Empire. So these countries, almost uniformly, the Spanish-speaking countries, at least in the past, were predominantly, more than predominantly, almost exclusively Catholic. So it's only been in the last maybe 50, 100 years that any other religions have gained any sizable membership in any of these countries. In order to understand Spanish language research, it's absolutely necessary to understand how the Catholic Church is organized. The Catholic Church is organized by geographic area, including the membership. So many people make up the lowest level, which is called the parish, and in Spanish, parroquia, and it's basically uh, the let's say on the ground active part of the Catholic Church. The person who uh, is presiding over or is in charge of the parish is the priest, and the priest in Spanish is a cura. So we have local parishes all over the Spanish-speaking world. These parishes are then organized in a group of dioceses, and the head of the diocese is a bishop, obispo in Spanish. And so and directly above that is the Pope. Now you'll hear about cardinals and archbishops and all that, but they're not part of the hierarchy. They're basically off to the side helping the Pope, not particularly involved in this process. Now, why is this important? It's because Catholic Church records, beginning as early as 1300 AD, have been kept by the local parishes. And it was not something that was instigated at any actual period in time. It was something that went along with the parish when the parishes were created. So in Spain, there are parishes that do go back that far. And in the New World and in the Americas, there, of course, are uh, parishes that go back into the 1500s. So you'll find records, you can find parish registers that actually do go back as far as the 1500s in Latin America, and in Spain further back, and records in Italy go back even further than that. But that's of course Italian. Now, the key to beginning Spanish language research is very, very simple and very straightforward. You have to identify an exact place where an event occurred in an ancestor's life, usually a baptism, marriage, or a burial. So, what does that mean? It means it's exactly what it says. You need to know the church where the baptism, marriage, or burial took place. And once you know that, then you have it's basically just going ahead and searching the records. Of course, the records need to be available and then they need to be accessible. So they have to have been created and have to have been preserved to the present time, and then they need to be available. Uh, FamilySearch.org has by far the largest collection of Spanish language records. Um, there are some Spanish language records for Mexico and some other countries on Ancestry, and there are some on MyHeritage. But for as far as doing Spanish language research, we're most definitely looking at FamilySearch.org. And I mentioned this, and I thought I'd show a kind of a picture of what you're going to have to deal with when you start looking at Spanish records. The earliest Catholic parish records date to 1500s. That's actually the cutoff. So this set of records here, that's 1536 to 1559, is definitely in the say outliers as far as the records are concerned. And they there are some in Spain primarily that go back earlier. So here's some records, the actual parish registers that would uh, be, were created in 1536 and 1537. Um, the language, of course, is one challenge. The handwriting is another challenge. Fortunately, handwriting is um, often, uh, there are exceptions, but it's often pretty good from the parishes, the parish records. In this particular case, I'm blowing this up so you can see it a little bit better. Um, you'll see a standard here. And what it is that over on the left-hand side, you'll see the some information. That's a kind of like a extraction from the record telling the person who was baptized or married or had who had been buried. Um, when I say that they were baptized, what that means is that there's very seldom that you'll see um, a uh, a birth record, and you'll very seldom see a death record. We'll get into another set of records that gets that's called civil registration records in just a moment, but the parish registers themselves only report baptisms, marriages, and burials. It is extremely rare that a priest will write down a birth date, and even more, it's even less often that you'll see a death date. So this is just the standard. Now, one thing that's also important to understand is that these records are basically uh, similar records regardless of the date. So here's jumping clear up to 1947, and the form and the format for these records, the content of the information is virtually identical with what you saw back in the 15 or 1600s. So this is a long time. Now, that's a great advantage to those doing genealogical research because as they do research, uh, they'll find out that there's the same wording in almost all these records. And so the only thing that's different is the names and places and the dates. But the format, the priest will write the same thing over and over and over again. So learning Spanish to speak Spanish would be nice, and to read it would be nice, but learning how to do genealogical research in Spanish is not nearly so hard as either of those because the amount of uh, of the language that's used, the number of different words and terms are very limited. So you can learn just a set of the language and do the research. Now, reading the handwriting is still always a challenge, even from records that are relatively recent, like this one from 1947. And one of the, of course, challenges we have presently in the United States is that a lot of the young people who are going through school are not being taught to write or read cursive. And so we have a generations of people coming up who simply cannot read this at all. So that's going to be another challenge for those people who do decide to do some genealogy, is they're going to have to learn how to read cursive. For most of us, though, we'd have to learn it ourselves. So I'll talk a little bit more about it, but the process is just one of acquiring a skill. You start with records that are uh, extremely well written, like these, and work through translating and understanding the record. And then, as you learn how to read this kind of record, you step backwards in time and keep learning as you go backwards in time, as you learn different um, writing styles. So, so here's a larger screenshot of exactly what the records look like. Now, once you get to the point where you can read these, you'll find that this is just a pleasure to read because it's very easy to read each of the what's going on exactly here with this. And over on the left-hand side, as I mentioned, this is a marriage record, and so there's two names there, and that's the names of both of the bride and the groom to the marriage. And I'm going to keep repeating this because it's important. The content and the language of these records has not changed very much since 1500s. There's just been no appreciable change. This record is just exactly the same, almost the same words. Okay, now what are you going to run into as you go back in time is that you're going to run into Latin, because at some point in time they began to use they'll begin to use more and more Latin terms. And if you get back into the 1500s, a significant portion of these records are going to be in Latin. And so that's another challenge, that the Latin, to learn the Latin. But then there again, the total uh, number of terms that you need to learn is relatively small. So starting over again with the concept of where do you start for getting to the records is uh, it's imperative that you know the exact place of an event in an ancestor's life. And when we say that, we mean sometimes these little tiny um, towns up in the mountains of either Spain or Latin American countries. And the other challenge of Latin America, as from Mexico down to Chile and Argentina, is that in some cases there's a significant part of the population that does not speak Spanish well, and they do speak their native languages, and there are a number of different native languages spoken throughout the Spanish-speaking world that are basically in the background of what's going on in the countries. And finding a parish where an ancestor lived can be a real challenge. So in this case, when you ask this question, and I do consultations for the Salt Lake Family Search Library, and every week I get a number of people, primarily in Spanish, um, who are searching for their ancestors. And the problem, and the always the same problem over and over again, is finding a place where that ancestor lived. And some of them and even finding a place where the ancestor, something where they died. So that's one of the major challenges. So if you're coming to me, for example, to begin a process of doing research for a Spanish-speaking ancestor, the first thing I'm going to ask is, where did an event occur in their lives? What was the church, the parish? And once you have the parish, once you get to the parish, it's very, very common that parish records will then contain virtually an entire your entire ancestry in that one parish, maybe in a few adjoining parishes if the parishes have changed and split and gotten new and during a newer time. So here you can see when you go to in the catalog, this is in the family search catalog, you go to a place in the catalog and everything starts out with a place. In this case, I put in Mexico, and then I put and looked for a place for the city of Mexico, Mexico City, which is separate from, of course, Mexico. And then these are the areas within Mexico City. These are actually towns within the Mexico City. So when you get down into the list, you'll find the records are geographically arranged by uh, the subdivisions, the jurisdictional subdivisions of the country. Now, another possible way of approaching it is if you know where the town where they came from, the town where your Spanish-speaking ancestors came from, then you can begin looking in Catholic directories. And this one is called gcatholic.org, and you can look up by countries. And when you're looking up by country, you can see where it says jurisdictions, and then you can split down through the jurisdictions. But you can actually, in this particular website, search by some of the smallest towns, and they will tell you and this will often tell you the diocese, which is where the bishop is, and the parish. So this is one way. The other thing about this is that there are a number of these Catholic directories, worldwide directories. So if you didn't find it in one, you might be able to find it in another. One thing I have found over time is that if I use um, some of the AI chatbots, the one that I've found to be the most useful in this regard has been the Copilot chatbot from Microsoft. And I have asked that Copilot, the Copilot, to give me the parish in a small town in Colombia or Ecuador or Mexico or wherever in Spain, and tell me what the parish is. And it's very, very frequently they will come up with exactly the right answer and with the diocese and often with the name of the bishop. So there are some ways today that you can do some research that may get through to these records more quickly. And it's important to understand that how important the parishes are, because from this slide, you can see that the Catholic Church in Mexico has 6,744 parishes. And then there are a lot of other um, centers. So The pastoral centers are ones that are less, are not the ones which keep records. So the parishes are the ones that need to keep the records, the parish church. The parish church is usually the main church in the town. So there may be other churches called iglesias that are not the parish church, but they are churches where the priest travels to that church do to perform the mass uh, and baptize into the but the records themselves are kept at the parish. Um, just looking at the size of the Catholic Church is amazing that the Catholic population is in the neighborhood of 42 million, and this is just in Mexico. So now to change to a little bit of a different record set. Uh, Basically, we're looking at the French Empire in 1812. This is all the blue is the part that France owned, and then the blue, light blue, is the extensions of the empire. And one thing that came out of the Napoleon's conquest of a significant part of Europe was that he created what was called civil government or civil government records or civil uh, registration records. And those records were mandated to contain births, marriages, and deaths, and began in France in 1792. And then it was mandated in other countries. Well, okay, so over time, as those records became more and more useful and more popular among various countries, then civil registration systems are used in about 37 different countries. And they have what we would call a functional civil registration and vital statistics systems for birth. Now, what does that mean? It means if you go find the record, there's a pretty good chance that the record's there and that there is let's call it moderately easy way to, not easy, but a moderate way to gain access to the records and actually find them. Then there's another 121 countries that have high or moderate performance systems. And that generally means that it's harder for a researcher to get a copy of the records. And then the remaining civil registration countries, the 30 other countries out there, have very weak performance systems, which means good luck. You may or may not get the record. Here, for example, with civil registration records, is if you look for civil registration records in a country like Argentina on Family Search, you may find that they're very scarce. There are hardly any, if any at all, of Argentine civil registration records. This does not mean that Argentina did not keep civil registration records. It reflects how they were kept. And so in Argentina, they're kept at the local or municipal record locations. So in order to get valid, useful copies of civil registration, uh, they would have to go to virtually every town and where there was a civil registration office in Argentina. But the good side of that is if you happen to have a contact in Argentina or you're in Argentina doing your research, then the civil registration records are obtainable. You can find them. And it's something that I see people pretty regularly have obtained at least some civil registration records about their families in doing research. Here, this is a search for Chilean civil registration records, and there's quite a few here from Chile. Those were microfilm records, but they've all now been digitized by Family Search. So they were digitized back in 2008. So when were these created? Well, there is a time lag. And if you think in terms of the mid 1800s for civil registration records, you'll see that they begin to appear at this time. It's kind of put into different layers. And first there's adoption, and then there's partial use, and then universal use. So there was a point in time which you may find some early records. There's a point in time when you might find some more early records, and then eventually they're fairly common across the country. They're very helpful in Mexico, for example, because from the middle of the country, they're very helpful in some of the other countries in Latin America. And so basically getting into the civil registration records is a different experience than doing parish registers, obviously. But here you can see how the various countries that are available where these records can be possibly possible. Now in Spain, it's a little bit different story. Um, the registration can date back to 1837. That's in some of the municipalities. So it just depends on the place where those records were being created. And then Spain's national civil registration system went into effect in 1870 and was established in 1870 and went totally into effect on January 1st, 1871. So after 1871, you will usually find civil registration records, whether Family Search or some other online website has the records is a completely different question. And that is probably changing as Family Search does additional digitizing of records in Spain and other Spanish-speaking countries. Now, once again, just to distinguish between the two, the parish registers record baptisms, marriages, and burials. The civil registration records births, marriages, and deaths. Okay. So when you speak of things like we have currently in the United States, where you say a birth certificate, there's really nothing corresponding to that in Latin America, but you can get a certified copy of the birth record from the civil registration. But if you're getting a copy of the um, record from the Catholic Church, you might get a summary from the Catholic Church, or if they allow you to take a digital copy or to obtain a digital copy, that you might get a digital copy of the record. But there's nothing like that in the church to certify a record. Now, that said, there's a different set of there's another legal entity in all of the Latin American countries and in many other countries, and they're called notaries. And a notary is a civil servant, somebody who works for the government directly or indirectly, and receives and gives authenticity to records that are created, usually legal records of some kind. Now, births, marriages, and deaths fall into that category. So it's very possible that someone would have gone to a notary to get a notarized birth record for some reason, or a notarized marriage records, perhaps for a passport or for immigration or emigration purposes or whatever. And so notaries have been around since the Roman Empire, literally. And so if you will find, even on Family Search, you'll find huge batches of notary records. The notary records are um, are quite extensive. So here's an example of a notarial record from 1765 in Guadalajara. Um, the notarial records they're legal documents. Okay, so the language is legal language, and they're authenticated by a public notary, and they may have just tons of genealogical information in them. And identifying the people and what's going on and whatever. If they sell property or enter into contracts or negotiate anything, they all have to go to the notary and get them notarized. That's been the practice in the United States for many years, and for that reason, they're somewhat familiar if you're familiar with legal documents. If you had to sell a house or whatever, the title company or the abstracting company that was handling the transaction would probably require you to have the documents notarized if they were to be recorded in the county recorder's office. So this is not something that's unusual or different or strange to even to people living in other countries. But in Spain, it's more inclusive that the kinds of things that end up in notary are rather extensive. Here's the challenge. The challenge is that, as you can see from this particular document in the screenshot, the text is pretty uniform. Well, and the problem is, as I mentioned with the parish registers, all the parish registers have the same format. They're the same language. The notary records are unique. Every single record is a unique record, and the language of the is just a narrative language of the event. And so picking out the information from a notary record would be tremendously difficult. And because even if you knew around the time period where your person may have lived, you have no idea when a notarial record would have been created. It had nothing particularly to do with the baptism or whatever. You can get a little bit of an idea if you knew some dates in your person's life. But the only solution would be to sit down and read these records page by page and see if you could find something that looked like your family. Now what's happened? Well, at least in Mexico and perhaps in other places where it's now been possible, the notarial records have been subjected to handwriting recognition. And that means that, as it shows you over here on the right-hand side of the slide, is that there is a transcription of the record. And so as you look at that, it may not make any sense to you unless you read Spanish. And even if you do read Spanish, it still may not make any sense because it's all in legal language. But you can learn the terms and you can use these, and you may be able to find significantly more information about your family depending on their location and their involvement with various transactions and things. So these are also very valuable records. And now with the family search, full text search, coupled with AI handwriting recognition, then they are completely searchable. So finding your person within these records is entirely possible. So where do you do that? Well, currently, the handwriting recognition full text search is in the familysearch.org/labs. Well, you can throw in the English part of that too. So /English or EN //labs. So when you're there, you go to the experiment and check how first step would be to check which of those records are available. When they initialized this now over a year ago at Roots Tech last year, um, this was the first set of records that they put up. And you'll notice that there was a Mexico notarial records from 1600 to 1909. And there are U.S. land and probate records, which are, parallel kind of records to those from 1630 to 1975. Both of these huge, huge databases are, and it's particularly these Mexican notarial records, are searchable by artificial intelligence. So you would want to come in here and start searching for your families in Mexico in these notarial records, even if you hadn't done anything else with your records previously. Now, one of these, um, the challenges of any looking at any of these records, whether it's notarial records or parish registers, the challenges are always the same. The first biggest challenge is availability. In other words, are they available? In that case, searching online may be helpful because there's possibilities that there are other sources for records from any country. And so even if you if you go into the records and find that Family Search has not managed to digitize the records that you need, you still need to go check all the other websites and also check uh, local websites. Now, how do you find these? Well, Google searches are very helpful when you start asking for Spanish language documents in Spain. Now, with regards to parish registers, I've already mentioned one of the ways to get to those records, is to actually go to the church. In other words, if you locate the church and the records haven't been digitized or they're not apparently available outside of the church itself, you can go directly to the parishes and the diocese to attempt to get the records. And when you do that, it's extremely uh, it may be a little bit difficult, but as I mentioned, there are ways with the Catholic directories to find those records, find the parishes, and there contact them directly. And when you contact them, it is good protocol to start out by saying, "I'm looking for my ancestors who lived in this parish, and I am willing to pay any of the expenses that may be incurred in finding or locating the records of my family." Now, if you come out and make that statement right at the beginning, you may solve some of the major problems. Is that you cannot assume that these people are going to do a search and work for you for nothing. So if you're willing to pay them, they may ask you to give a donation to the church, or they may just have somebody who will do the records for a fee. And maybe not. Maybe they don't want to do it. Maybe they'll tell you they don't have the records. Well, okay, so the parish priest, you contact the parish, and the parish priest says, "I don't have the records. They were burned," or I don't have them. Well, the one thing that's important to understand is that the diocese, the bishop, will periodically, usually annually, come and make a second copy of the records. So they'll come and copy out everything the priest has done during the preceding year. These are called bishop's transcripts. And the bishop transcripts are also available. And if you're searching for records online from Family Search, for example, you may find that the records are in the parish listed, but you may also find the same record or a real copy, another copy that is actually available from the diocese. So Family Search may have digitized the record in the diocese, and then didn't want to do another copy of the records at the parish level. Or they may have started at the parish level and they may not have gone to the diocese. So these are kind of the iterations on availability. Of course, at this point, then handwriting is a major issue as to how you're going to be able to, if you can read what it says. I have to admit that some of the parishes and some of the places have had tremendous problems. I said earlier that their handwriting was pretty was readable in most cases, except for the fact when, uh, for example, and this is just an example, and it didn't have anything particularly to do with the location, but in one point in time, I was doing research in Puerto Rico for parish registers, and it appeared like the priest ran out of supplies for ink because the letters would get less and less readable. They'd be fading and fading away and fading away. Then they'd start dark again and dark and dark and dark, fading, fading, fading. And it just went like that. If you happened to be finding it in the fading area, it was very, very difficult. So the third thing you need to do is do what we're doing right here, have knowledge about the records, where they're located, how they're formatted, what kind of information you're going to get, and also what kind of effort is going to be necessary for the records to be for you to find the records. So check this, check availability, check handwriting, and check your knowledge. That's the key to getting into any of these records. By the way, you can expand that concept to obtaining almost any records anywhere. One place to start is the Research Wiki on the familysearch.org. It's under the search tab on all the pages. And the Research Wiki you go in by country. Obviously, everything's place oriented. And then there are record types. And this will give you a sort of a ballpark of what kinds of records are available and what are not available in any particular area. And the only thing I can also say about this is that anything that I've said about availability of the records could be changing today because Family Search and other companies are aggressively digitizing and collecting records from around the world. So the fact that your record isn't there today doesn't mean that it won't be there tomorrow. And that's an important thing to understand. Now, there are ways to learn how to read the handwriting, and one of them is the BYU or Brigham Young University script tutorial. This is a free website. Just look for BYU script tutorial, and they'll be teaching you how to do languages like Spanish and Dutch and English and Catalan and other languages that perhaps you're not familiar with. So here's the Spanish tutorial from English and Espanol. Now, I've talked primarily about church records and civil registration records and notary records. You can see from this list of the blue records that are highlighted here for Mexico that there may be other records available. Uh, the the main issue with most of the other records is twofold. For example, probate records. Now, in the United States, back maybe 75 or 100 years, probate records were marvelous because they're going to be almost uniformly enforced for everybody. And going back much earlier in the United States, it didn't matter. Even if you were totally destitute, you still had to go through probate because they were going to sell your boots and your saddle and your horse. So that's the kind of records. So sometimes probate records are helpful in these other countries. But all of these records are worth looking at and knowing about. and there might be a possibility to finding the people. Now, if you're going to learn, if you want to learn in a way that's sequenced and educationally oriented, and gives you a pathway to learn things step by step, then you have the Family History Guide, which is the fhguide.com. And the Family History Guide is a step-by-step way to learn about each of the countries. So there's articles and references here to the training for all of those Latin American countries. Then we also have on the BYU a virtual help desk. And there's a link here. This is the new website for the library. There's an old website. If you get the old website, then there's a virtual help desk link in the upper right-hand corner. Here, if you click more, what you'll get is, excuse me, back. What you'll get is a link that goes directly to the library during the time that it's open, and there's the hours are posted. And this way you can talk directly to the library, the BYU library. And during the time that the library is open, nearly every day there is someone there who can speak Spanish. Spanish is very commonly known by people in the library. So looking for Spanish language records is something that most of the library missionaries can help. So now you're looking at the text, and this is, I decided I'd give you something that was a little bit more of a challenge. And it would take a while and a lot of practice and learning before you would be able to be able to just read through this. But it's readable, even though this doesn't look like the perfect language. It is actually fairly readable. So we learn step by step as we go in here and do this. My recommendation is when you read it and look at it, you try to read each of the words, anything you can read, and then you put it down after 15 minutes or half an hour and come back the next day and read it. Do the same thing day after day. And by 3 or 4 or 5 days, generally speaking, it'll make sense. But that's presupposing that you know the language. So you need to start learning the basic words. Um, it's also from the standpoint of understanding anything about genealogy. We need to know the history. And this is a website that has the online histories of the Spanish Empire. So it's something that you might want to be interested in learning. Now, I graduated in Spanish from the University of Utah, the degree, and probably a significant portion of the time that I was studying and the classes I was taking were involved in the research of the history. This was my key to the language when I went on a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I uh, found this book. Someone told me this was the way to go with the book. And this was for Argentina, and it's called El Habla de mi Tierra. And it was what it would do was tell me how they said the words in Argentine and how you were supposed to say them when you're speaking Spanish. So it was helpful because a few of the people actually spoke Spanish. The rest of them all spoke Argentine dialect. And so learning the dialect was important because this book was about 2 inches thick and it went through everything I ever needed to know. You do not have to know how to speak Spanish or any other language to do genealogical research, but it certainly helps. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Okay, well, thanks for watching and hope we see you again. This was a picture I actually took in Argentina, so That's what it looked like a long time ago.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on March 19th with Maureen Brady on Scottish family history research, historical and geographical background. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.